Welcome to The Long Run. This is a podcast for biotech adventurers. I'm your host, Luke Timmerman. Today's guest is Lyn Baranowski. Lyn is the CEO of Boston-based Avalyn Pharma. The company is developing inhalable drugs for rare and severe lung diseases, such as pulmonary fibrosis and other interstitial lung diseases. Avalyn has started with a couple of small molecules that are given orally and remade them into inhalable drugs so they can be more effectively delivered where they need to go, deep in the lungs. By concentrating delivery, the idea is that Avalyn will be able to lower the doses needed and make treatments that are easier for patients to tolerate over the long term. In this episode, you'll hear Lyn's enthusiasm for developing better treatments for respiratory diseases. It's one of these therapeutic areas that doesn't capture a lot of news coverage, but lung diseases of one kind or another really affect many millions of people. Now, before we get started, a word from the sponsor of the show, AlphaSense. Under unprecedented time and cost pressures, many life sciences teams have reached for off-the-shelf AI tools to stay afloat. Yet they have discovered that generic AI tools introduce new risks, such as hallucination. Tools that cannot withstand scientific or regulatory scrutiny are a liability in MLR review, portfolio committees, and investment decisions where every claim must be traceable to a source. More than isolated tools, teams need a purpose-built intelligence layer designed for the rigor that the industry demands. Across life sciences functions, platforms like AlphaSense are streamlining the entire decision cycle. Go to timmermanreport.com for a link to download a report that covers the top AI use cases that have transformed how the industry's leading teams reach defensible answers. And, quick question. When was the last time a CRO told you what something costs before you signed an NDA, sat through 2 scoping calls, and waited a week for a scope of work? In bioanalysis, pricing gets treated like a closely guarded secret. Dash Bio thinks that's backward. It publishes pricing publicly on its website and even has a calculator that shows how the price changes if you redesign your study. You can see what your study costs before you talk to a human being. No surprise line items, no it depends, no games. Dash was built to be the bioanalysis company that's actually straightforward to work with. Transparent pricing, guaranteed timelines, and data in days, not months. If you're tired of pricing that feels like a negotiation every single time, run your bioanalysis with Dash. Visit dash.bio/pricing and see exactly how much your next bioanalysis study will cost. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Lyn Baranowski on The Long Run. Lyn Baranowski, welcome to The Long Run.
Hi, Luke. So happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Lyn. I'm eager to get into this with you about respiratory drug development. And, it all goes back to, I think, of some fundamentals of health, the clean air, clean water. We take these things for granted. They're really important. But not everybody is lucky. Sometimes things go wrong as life goes on, and we need medicines. And this is what you do.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Lung disease is an important area that needs more research and development. So something I'm real passionate about.
Okay, so I want to find out how you got to this place to become a respiratory drug development person. So let's just start from the beginning. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Hollis, New Hampshire, so a small town north of Boston, outside the city. But I was always someone that was just curious, I think, and attracted to the goings on in the city. And so, found my way to college in DC. And I was actually a diplomat for the government, doing really non-biotech work for a bunch of years.
So what did your mom and dad do in Hollis?
My mom was actually a nurse practitioner, and a super smart lady. She taught nursing at a local college and then ultimately ran a hospice agency in New Hampshire. My dad was a software engineer who was really a recruiter for many years. So,
Okay. And what kind of schools did you attend?
Public high schools. My graduating class in high school was, I think, 104 people. So, small town living, one traffic light, lots of fruit farms. But I think got a really good education. It was a good school system despite how small it was.
What kinds of things were you most interested in as a kid?
I thought I was going to be a lawyer initially. I was always really interested in languages, kind of the social sciences, humanities. I was kind of good at everything. I'll tell you, in high school, though, did not like chemistry. It's just so funny that I landed here, but loved biology, anatomy. I was also really into theater and really anything to do with arts. So was always really inclined towards, I'm not an artist myself, but just have always been an admirer of arts and sort of an aficionado.
Well, it's interesting you say that as because we're about the same age, and we both went to small public schools, and one of those schools, there's a lot of opportunity to do lots of different things. There's only so many who want to be on the yearbook or the school play, and so you kind of do everything. So you got exposed to a lot of things.
Yeah, that's right. And that was very much my path was sort of through. I was always very academically oriented and kind of self-driven, but really enjoyed a lot of those activities outside of school as well.
What was it that you loved about biology and not chemistry?
It's funny looking back on it. I think that my chemistry professor was just not someone that was probably a great teacher. And it's amazing when reflecting back on what you liked or didn't like. To me, had more to do with the quality of the teacher and how interesting they made the topic versus rote learning. And I think my biology teachers were always just more curious minds in that way and kind of encouraged us to think with curiosity as opposed to just rote learning about whatever the topics were. I remember a particular really interesting anatomy and physiology class. I just, kind of how the body worked was always a topic that I was really interested in.
Yeah, teachers are so important. They don't get enough credit. Okay, so you ended up going, you said, to American University in DC. Why did you do that? And what were you thinking you might do?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was always really interested in languages too. So I was, for some strange reason, just really good at French and really interested in French. And through the high school years, I ended up going to be a study abroad student in France. We had a study abroad student from France. I went to a French camp one summer, just was really always interested in sort of international topics, which makes no sense given that I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire. But when I went to college, I think I was just wanting to be in the center of action, which felt like Washington, D.C., and studying international something. And so I got a big scholarship to go to American University, which is why I chose it. And, had a great few years there and worked a lot in, international affairs, international politics type roles as an intern during those 4 years in college, not so much in science. So it's just funny how my life has transpired.
Yeah, yeah. So were you thinking you might, I don't know, become a diplomat or trade rep or something like that?
That's exactly what I was thinking. And I did stay in that field for a few years, 4 years after college and did that kind of work. And it was, an amazing few years. I couldn't see the future. I think that the future for me in those roles, next step for me would have been to go be posted abroad. And I was, 23, 24, 25, and I just wasn't ready to be posted abroad. I think the Foreign Service is a little challenging in the sense that in those first few years as a Foreign Service officer, you don't have a lot of say in where you get posted. And I just wasn't ready to sort of do that. I was just still curious to learn more and find more and grow more before I kind of settled into what felt like a long-term career.
You had an initial curiosity or maybe wanderlust, see the world kind of thing, impulse that a lot of young people do, but then you didn't see a path. So how did you end up moving over to industry?
Yeah. So I went back to business school. I decided I wanted to get a graduate degree. So I got my MBA at Harvard Business School. And I remember really clearly, it's funny, in those years, I was trying to think about what kind of business I wanted to work in. And I actually had a set of criteria in my head. I can even tell you what they were because it still feels fresh for me. It was, I wanted an industry that was going to be complex and difficult because I'm smart and I get bored. And I wanted an industry that would actually keep me learning and keep me challenged intellectually for the course of a career. I wanted to work with good, smart humans that were mission driven, kind of number three, mission driven, something that felt like we were doing something important to contribute to the overall well being of people and not, for example, selling Coca Cola or making Jello. Um, I wanted an industry that was very international because that for me was part of who I am and who I was. And I wanted an industry that was actually heavily regulated because I came from this DC, 8 years in DC in undergrad and then 4 years after undergrad. And so I understood kind of how Washington operated and the regulatory environment that companies might have to deal with. And I thought that that would be something I could bring to a company that I joined. So in those years, I ended up doing a project initially for GSK, looking at their HIV/AIDS efforts in South Africa and recommending to them how they might think differently about marketing those medicines. And honestly, like it was like a light bulb went off for me. It I was like, oh my God, here's an industry where it really meets all those criteria. And that was the beginning, and here I am. So I've never looked back, and it's been the joy of life to be able to do what I've done in this career and in this industry.
With those criteria that you mentioned, I mean, did your classmates look at you like, boy, she's kind of an odd one? Because they were going to, I would imagine, consulting firms or Wall Street or Silicon Valley. Probably not a whole lot landed in the same place as you did.
No, but I think it's probably just a nature of me as a human. I've never been someone that followed the crowd or thought the way everyone else thought. I've always kind of been very self-directed, and it's been important to me to find my own path. And so for me, it just felt quite right. And I did have some amazing friends in business school. One of my best friends, David Leopold, I remember so clearly sitting with him through hours of discussion on the couch about these kinds of topics because he was similarly thinking for himself about what he wanted his life to be like. And Yeah, it's just part of who I am, I think. But I'm so glad I am that way because I think I've been able to construct for myself a life and a career that I'm really proud of.
Okay, so this would have been, I guess, the early 2000s. So you mentioned HIV for GSK. This was around the time the early protease inhibitors had been out on the market. GSK, Gilead, others, and um, they were transforming HIV treatment into a chronic illness. They were life-saving treatments, but there was this challenge with getting them accessible, making them widely distributed to the areas of need. And so you got to work on one of those challenges.
Oh, that was just a project for GSK, sort of during B school. So I did, but only very briefly. But it was again enough to whet my appetite and get me really excited about the potential to help these companies do meaningful good in the world. So
Yeah.
that was kind of the start of the interest. And then I did a project for Novartis after that, which was a little different. That was Dan Basello was the CEO at the time. And so I and some business school classmates did some work for him and Novartis, looking at what Novartis's global public affairs and communications operations were like and how we would recommend doing things differently such that Novartis could become more of a leader in kind of public affairs and policy work. And that then led me on to my post business school years and time at Novartis. So
Okay, so
that Novartis project was really instrumental for me.
that was while you were a business school student.
Yeah, it was my last
Yeah.
semester of B school. Yeah, so it was like a semester long project for Novartis that that I got credit for. But I was just naturally excited about it, so I probably put 10 times more effort into it than I probably needed to, just because of how excited I was to try to help Novartis.
Did you get to meet senior leadership?
Yeah, Dan was part of that project himself personally, so I did get to meet Dan, and certainly then over the course of time, others in the Novartis organization. When I went to Novartis full time, I worked for a fellow named Steve Kalmar. He's just also been a luminary in health policy over the course of his career, initially in Congress, then at a device company, and now works for a healthcare service delivery company. But he was my boss at Novartis initially, and amazing mentor, amazing human being, someone that I've just loved for years. So.
Now, did that project pave the way for you to get your first real industry job there at Novartis?
Yeah, exactly. Dan pretty much at the end of the project said, "Hey, what are you doing after school? And do you want to come work at Novartis?" And I, the opportunity to go live and work in Basel, Switzerland, to me felt like something I could never pass up. Why would I want to? So I jumped in with 2 feet first into Switzerland and Novartis for a few years.
Okay. And what kinds of things did you work on when you were full time there
Yeah,
in
so I was
Switzerland?
working for the Steve Kalmar. So I was working for Steve and Dan, and worked on all kinds of different projects. So I was a bit of a chief of staff for Steve, so helping direct and oversee the global public affairs and communications teams at Novartis, and then got to work on things like the one that's most memorable for me is a project we worked on for a drug called Coartem. So it was a malaria medicine, sorry, that we were trying to figure out at Novartis how we could deploy it to Africa. We were willing to give it away at cost, just to try to make a difference. The efficacy of it looked to be far superior to what was commercially available at the time. But it was a lot of work, as you might imagine, with organizations like the WHO and all its ancillary organizations with African governments to try to make that medicine available at scale in African countries and figure out how to get it to the people that needed it. And so I got to work with the brand team on that, but it was a lot of policy work. So that was a lot of fun, and really fulfilling, because I think that medicine has probably saved millions of lives now. So, for me, doing meaningful good and feeling like I'm having an impact is really important to the joy I derive from my job.
And it sounds like pretty early on, you got exposure to a variety of functions within the company. So you learned um, to be versatile, I guess, or cross-functional. I'm not sure how you put it, but you didn't get just stuck in one lane.
No, it was great that way. I think when you're curious and you're, I guess, unique in the organization in that way, you sort of have an opportunity to learn and grow in all kinds of different directions. So I got to work on all kinds of cool projects in those years.
Okay, so where did you go after Novartis? What did you do after that?
Yeah, so I stayed with Novartis for a few more years. I moved back to the U.S. and I'd wanted to find my way into a role in business development because, referencing back to the earlier stage of my career, I've been a negotiator. I've done trade deals with foreign governments in those years after I graduated undergrad, and I loved that deal making negotiation skill set, and thought that that would be applicable to a business development role at Novartis. And so I found my way into that function at Novartis, and worked with another group of amazing humans, this time in the U.S. And that was actually the first time I worked in the respiratory therapeutic area. And it was a super interesting time at Novartis because we were at the time launching Xolair, which we did with Genentech. And we were thinking about how do we want to grow in this therapeutic area. So I was the person on the team working for the therapeutic area head, thinking about growth opportunities and different indications that were unserved, and where we might want to build. And so it ended up becoming just the start of my time in respiratory, and it probably is the a really important part of my career, because it's where I got that real passion that I still have for still trying to do and accomplish more and develop more medicines to get more patients more options in this area.
Now, you were working in business functions on the business side of the house, so to speak, but you didn't have the scientific background, as you said. How did you um, how did you get up to speed on that area of the business? How did you get comfortable with it? How did you learn?
Yeah, I think I'm just naturally a curious person. So I think that every time I would work on a project, I would just dig in. So I remember one time, for example, I was working with the franchise area head. Her name was Kim Stratton, and we were thinking about buying or licensing in a drug for rheumatoid arthritis. And I really wanted to understand the mechanisms and how the existing drugs, which at the time were like Humira and Enbrel, were working, and how these other medicines that we were thinking about work differently. And so I think I just spent, I don't know how many hours, but time trying to just dig in and understand it and learn. And I remember so clearly having a meeting with Kim as we were presenting this opportunity. It was to buy a product from another company that we didn't end up executing on, but she asked during the meeting, how does this drug that we're thinking about work? and how's it different from the others? And I explained, in kind of common English,
Hmm.
and that she would understand. And she's a nurse and very smart herself, so I didn't need to explain it in common English, but I did. And we had the meeting, and at the end of the meeting, she said to me, and I remember so clearly, she said, "Very few people could explain to me what you just did. You have a special skill at this. Don't lose that." That was really impressive. And so, she became a great mentor to me. But I think for some reason I'm just good at translating the science into language people can understand and making it real for them, not dumbing it down, but not kind of getting into the details too much either. So I think that's just a natural skill I have. I'm not sure where I learned it, maybe in the diplomacy training. But I've definitely leveraged that skill now over many companies in many years.
Huh. Yeah, it sounds like you weren't intimidated. You just jumped right in. Just dig in.
And ask a lot of questions. I mean, I remember another time where it's so funny. I wasn't sure really what a large molecule was, right, or what a monoclonal antibody was. And I had a colleague who was biomedical engineer, and I remember sitting with him in his office and asking him to draw it out for me on his whiteboard, and he did, right. So I think I was just, as you said, not shy, curious, not shy, and willing to do the work to understand it. So I think I've carried that through. And so every disease I work in, it's the same. I just want to really dig in and understand it. And over the course of time, you just build a knowledge base, that continues to kind of grow and mature.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it accumulates. So, okay, so you had early exposure on the Xolair project, you said. Now, for those not familiar, how would you describe what was Xolair? What was it aiming to treat?
Yeah, it treats severe asthma, and a really interesting molecule, large molecule, but really interesting in that it appears to now have efficacy really across any kind of allergy, right? So it's been interesting to watch Xolair long after I ever left that work, just thrive and grow. But to be clear, I didn't work so much on Xolair myself. I was thinking about what else we could do to kind of bolster on. So we ended up buying, for example, at Novartis, a drug called tobramycin, that was from Chiron. So we bought Chiron to get our hands on Toby, and then I was on that program working on thinking about how we life cycle manage it with the brand director. So started just working all these different indications. I actually did work in IPF at the time, and I again remember so clearly just being so sad to understand how horrible pulmonary fibrosis is. And at the time, there was nothing approved, and really was just eager to myself contribute to that and try to find some more solutions for those patients, because these respiratory diseases, particularly these rare ones, I just think have not gotten enough attention from industry in terms of research and development and trying to find solutions. There are just hundreds, literally, of diseases that are unaddressed in the lung, and so that's really where I've stayed focused now. As I've grown in my career over time.
Yeah, IPF, it's idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which literally means lung scarring from some reason we don't really understand.
Yep.
How's that for humbling? There's people who spend the lifetime studying this, trying to understand those mechanisms, and we start there, and then you can develop treatments. So, okay, so what was it you think about? I mean, you said that respiratory drug development seemed underserved, but what else about it appealed to you as an area that you could really just dive in and be endlessly curious and never bored and useful?
Yeah. So that was definitely one part of it, and it still animates me today. The unmet need, the patient need, how much there is to do, how little we still have, how much more there is to do. That's very much a big driver. But the other half of it that to me has always felt equally compelling is that there's this very interesting nuance to building commercial products in respiratory when you deliver them with an inhalation. So when you have an inhaler in play, that introduces a device into the label and into the development pathway. And there are some nuances to kind of how you can develop drugs in the device that, frankly, add a lot of complexity and challenges to drug development. So don't want to understate the importance of that. But they also introduce some really nuanced barriers to entry to generics. And so, long story short, because of that, um, respiratory for inhaled therapies is an area where you can build really meaningful commercial opportunities, and they're just less impacted by generics owing to the complexities and the rules the FDA has for inhaled generics. And so it's an opportunity in the therapeutic area to also build durable businesses, right? And build durable revenue streams and products. So the commercial strategic part of my brain, the other half of my brain, I think loves that as much as I love the unmet need in the patient side. So that's why I've stayed in the therapeutic area my whole career. Every time I think about something else, there's so much more to do here. And I just get excited still about the opportunity to build new companies and new products.
So you had your big company experience, and that did help define, it sounds like, where you wanted to go longer term. And then, you went to startup world. Maybe we can go over this kind of quickly, but I guess it was Pearl Therapeutics and Altavant were a couple of them. What were some of your couple key kind of takeaway experiences from the world of biotech entrepreneurship?
Yeah, sure. And maybe before I get there, I'll just kind of also mention that between the two, between Novartis and Pearl, I was an investor for a couple of years in a family office in New York, which I think also was a very helpful experience for me because I got to understand and experience and know how investors think about companies and how they think about investing and what they're looking for. I think that's also been an equally important experience to me in all that followed. Pearl was my first little company. It was a company I actually had invested in, and we took a controlling interest in Pearl. And then I left that firm and joined Pearl full time. And that was a company that was working in asthma and COPD, doing fixed dose combination in inhalers. We sold it to AstraZeneca a few years later. And, I'll tell you that, as I'm sure you know, with every biotech company, the path to success is never linear, right? So it's like when you join a biotech company, you're getting on a roller coaster. You just don't know what the roller coaster ride is going to be, but likely there's ups and there's downs and there's twists and there's turns, and there's dark days and there are hard moments. But it feels like over the course of the companies until this one, the key differentiator to success is just the fundamental belief that you have to have in what you're doing, and frankly, grit and resilience to finding a way to make it work. And I would say that every time for me until now, and I've been through some tough moments and tough things, but every single time I found a way to make them work. And there's something about that I just enjoy. It's fun. It's challenging intellectually, mentally, but boy, does it feel good when you figure out a way to 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 find success, despite those challenges. So I think I'm a little bit probably addicted to that roller coaster ride experience.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely need that resilience to get through those hard times, and then also just the fortitude to stick with something long enough so that good fortune can smile upon you.
Definitely, and the wisdom to know when it's time to move on to the next, right? So
Yeah.
all those things. Yep.
Okay. So you had success at these, ultimately at these companies. They were acquired. And you took on, I guess your career, you were just climbing the ladder. It looks like you increasing roles of responsibility. What were some of the key things that you learned, in taking on those new roles?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think that every time you take on a new set of responsibility, I think you've got to be humble and curious at the same time, right? So back to those parts of me that I really like, the curiosity to know what you don't know and be willing to learn. I think the humility to know what you don't know and be willing to listen to people that know more and learn from them. And I think I learned a lot of management and leadership skills over the years, right? So just as my roles increased in up the ranks, basically, understanding how to work with people, understanding how to motivate them, how to lead them, were all important skill sets that I needed for this job.
Yeah, not everything that they teach at Harvard Business School.
No, no, it's funny though, Luke. They do tell you at Harvard Business School that people are the most important thing, and when you're at Harvard Business School and they tell you people are the most important thing, I think most everyone's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's true. People are the most important thing. And, understanding people and how to lead them and how to motivate them and how to inspire them, is a lot of fun, but it's very nuanced. It's hard to probably really teach. So you've got to, I think, be good at, again, humility and just learning and growing and synthesizing what you learn as you go.
Under unprecedented time and cost pressures, many life sciences teams have reached for off-the-shelf AI tools to stay afloat. Yet they have discovered that generic AI tools introduce new risks, such as hallucination. Tools that cannot withstand scientific or regulatory scrutiny are a liability in MLR review, portfolio committees, and investment decisions where every claim must be traceable to a source. More than isolated tools, teams need a purpose-built intelligence layer designed for the rigor that the industry demands. Across life sciences functions, platforms like AlphaSense are streamlining the entire decision cycle. Go to timmermanreport.com for a link to download a report that covers the top AI use cases that have transformed how the industry's leading teams reach defensible answers. A quick question. When was the last time a CRO told you what something costs before you signed an NDA, sat through 2 scoping calls, and waited a week for a scope of work? In bioanalysis, pricing gets treated like a closely guarded secret. Dash Bio thinks that's backward. It publishes pricing publicly on its website and even has a calculator that shows how the price changes if you redesign your study. You can see what your study costs before you talk to a human being. No surprise line items, no it depends, no games. Dash was built to be the bioanalysis company that's actually straightforward to work with. Transparent pricing, guaranteed timelines, and data in days, not months. If you're tired of pricing that feels like a negotiation every single time, run your bioanalysis with Dash. Visit dash.bio/pricing and see exactly how much your next bioanalysis study will cost. So you discovered that these senior roles actually suited you, that there was a progression there. You felt comfortable, increasingly confident, it sounds like. Let's talk now about Avalyn. How did you end up coming to this company that you're at currently?
Yeah, sure. So in the company that I was at before Avalyn, it was called Ultimate, and we'd sold it to Sumitomo. And after we sold it to Sumitomo, I stuck around for a period just to help that company continue to grow and thrive. And at some point, though, I'm fundamentally an entrepreneur. I think I'm just most well suited to these kinds of growing companies. And so at some point, I was just ready for a new challenge. And Sumitomo had in its pipeline an asset that they were no longer interested in investing in, and I thought it was the coolest asset that we had put into the pipeline at Altivant. And so I set to work on thinking about spinning that out into a new company. And as part of that work, I got to meet a bunch of the investors in Avalyn, and they eventually asked if I'd be interested in taking on Avalyn as a challenge. And I'd known Avalyn actually for many years leading up to that discussion, that point, because I just thought it was a brilliant idea to do what Avalyn is doing, and we can talk about that. And so I was always admiring the strategy at Avalyn. And so when that opportunity presented itself, it was an opportunity I just couldn't say no to. It felt like, just honestly, almost like the perfect opportunity for me, given my interest and my background.
Okay, so paint the picture for me. What was the situation that you walked into there first day at Avalyn?
Yeah, so I was replacing an outgoing CEO who's been a world leader in developing drugs for respiratory products. And the board had decided to move on from that before I joined, obviously. And so I inherited the company, and didn't have upon joining, a ton of financial resources. So basically, the board gave me, a modest check and said, "Here's the check you have. Here's the amount of money you have to figure out a new program, a new plan for the company." And the assets have stayed the same, so we haven't changed the company's focus at all. It was more thinking about the new plan and figure out KOL support for it, talk to the FDA about it, and raise money to fund the new plan. And so I had a fairly tight budget, and had to do some layoffs in the company just to get through without going bankrupt. And was able to do all that. So put in place a new plan, talked to KOLs, got FDA input, and then 9 months later raised $175 million, which was enough money for us to get started on the plan and really start rebuilding the company because I'd had to skinny it down. I think at some point we were probably around 10 people or less. And I needed a new chief medical officer. I needed a chief operating officer. I needed a chief financial officer. I needed kind of everything. So, I was able to get started in 2023 in the fall on really that rebuilding effort with putting in place the new team and the new plan.
That's a pretty big reset. So
I don't know how I got through those 9 months, Luke, honestly, but those were the hardest 9 months of my life easily.
yeah, well, first time CEO, you're probably wondering, boy, if I blow this, there might not be another.
Yeah, it was stressful. It was hard. I was very alone, but um, I managed to get it done. So
Well,
proud
okay,
of
so
myself for the grit and resilience to get through these hard moments.
so what were those assets that appealed to you from the get-go?
In the last 10 years, there were two drugs that had been approved for pulmonary fibrosis. So those two drugs are called pirfenidone and nintedanib, and they're approved and only available as oral agents. And this, I should say, as we get into the discussion about pulmonary fibrosis is a rare, deadly diagnosis. Survival with a disease is only about 3 to 5 years, and it's worse than most forms of cancer. And I think what many people don't understand on the investor side is despite the fact that we have a few drugs approved for this deadly disease, very few patients are actually able to take either of those oral medicines because they're both almost impossible for patients to tolerate. So, what I mean by that, just think about the patients for a minute. You're talking about a patient that's older and frail. They have limited breathing capacity. They have limited exercise capacity. They have lots of issues with cough. And pirfenidone introduces now another set of symptoms, which have to do with nausea and vomiting. Nintedanib causes horrible diarrhea. And so we're effectively asking patients that have this quite limited breathing capacity and limited exercise capacity to effectively spend all of their exercise capacity going back and forth to the bathroom dealing with the consequence of the meds. So for that reason, patients sometimes don't even bother trying to take the orals, or if they do, most of them will cycle off therapy really within the first few months. So if you look at the market, at any one point in time, you'll see only about 30% of patients being treated with one of the oral meds. Over the course of the year, it's only about 10% of patients, we think, that are able to take and stay on meds. So it leaves this massive set of patients unaddressed. And again, it's just a crime because of how horrible this disease is. So what Avalyn is doing is rather than taking those meds with an oral agent, we're instead delivering those same two drugs to the lung directly with an inhalation. And when you do that, you can drop the dose substantially as compared to the oral version because you're putting it all into the right place, into the right organ. So pirfenidone, as an example, goes from 2,400 milligrams a day orally to 200 milligrams a day with the inhalation. But despite the fact that we're able to drop the dose, because we're putting it all into the lung directly, we actually have better exposure in the lung at that fraction of a dose, which we think is going to translate into better efficacy than you'd see with the oral. And on the safety side of the equation, when you avoid most of the systemic exposure that you have with the oral, that appears to largely resolve many of these tolerability issues that limit adoption. So, what we're fundamentally doing at Avalyn is taking drugs that we know work, but delivering them in a much more sensible way that allows us to resolve the issues that are the challenges for patients. And if we can do that, we think we can keep patients on therapy substantially longer, allowing them to benefit from the efficacy of the drugs. So it's to me an obvious opportunity to do better by patients by thinking about the patient needs and how to meet those needs in a new way. And I think in drug development, we often kind of miss those questions or don't think about them. And I think there are so many business opportunities when you are able to think about them.
Well, and even despite all the challenges you outline, I think pirfenidone So that was originally developed by Intermune, acquired by Roche. I think that achieved peak sales of over $1 billion a year, even though it was not very well tolerated and a small fraction of the eligible patients actually got it. So investors look at that and think, if you can reach a larger portion of the addressable market and have an IP position that's a competitive moat that's pretty deep and wide, so it can extend for a very long time. That's a pretty good, durable business opportunity.
That's right. And you'll be shocked to understand this, but I think this tells you probably everything you need to know about that. Ofev is today, that's the oral nintedanib, is a $4 billion drug. But the market, if you just look at the US, ignoring everywhere else in the world, in the US, we have about 300,000 patients per year that have diagnosed pulmonary fibrosis. There are two forms of the disease, one idiopathic, one non-idiopathic, collectively 300,000 patients. The lowest brand pricing in the marketplace today is around 150,000 per patient per year. It's a rare, deadly disease. And so if you just do the math, 300,000 patients times 150,000 per patient per year, you're talking about a US market size today of $42 billion. And that assumes every patient is on one med, ignoring possible combinations. So it gives you a sense, Luke, of, as I said, how much more there is to do here, and how many patients are really unaddressed, given that these drugs have done well. They're both commercially successful programs, but there's much more that we can do.
And do we even know true incidence and prevalence of these diseases, or are there a lot of people just kind of slipping through the cracks, undiagnosed?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We don't really know. So I think there's a lot of probably misdiagnosis or lack of diagnosis. We do know that the non-idiopathic form of the disease is caused by an underlying interstitial lung disease. Many of the patients we see with what we call that disease progressive pulmonary fibrosis, many of those patients have an underlying autoimmune disease. So think about diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. Unfortunately, some of those patients with systemic RA, for example, go on to develop ILD, interstitial lung disease, and where they have an upregulation in their immune response with some antigens being expressed. And that inflammation that results from that upregulation progresses into becoming this downstream fibrosis. I do worry myself in the future about, we think a lot about smoke inhalation now,
Yep.
the vaping associated lung injury. We call that EVOLI. Chemical exposure. So I don't know if you remember the Iraq war vets, there was a lot of discussion that Jon Stewart was leading around burn pit. That's chemical lung exposure. And those exposure related interstitial lung diseases may all become fibrotic too. So, there's just, again, there's a lot of underlying diagnoses that become fibrotic where these drugs could apply. And I think, to your point, the likely growth in our ability to detect these diseases and diagnose them will probably lead to higher numbers of patients that are going to need to be served in the future.
Well, and folks who are about our age might remember 9/11 and the first responders there. They were breathing in a lot of those small particulates, and that ended up lodging in their lungs and causing a lot of IPF. And it's really sad. And I wonder too, when I look at events around the world, whether it be an earthquake somewhere like Venezuela, and you get all these old buildings with a lot of old building materials, they fall and people start breathing it. They go through the rubble, they breathe in all this stuff. What's going to happen to their lungs over the long term?
I worry about the same thing. Yeah.
Okay. So coming back to what you have there, you described the molecules themselves, the pirfenidone and how did you say it? The
Nintedanib.
nintedanib. I need to practice that one.
Okay.
Those were in the small molecule orally available formulation from those other manufacturers. Then the first one, pirfenidone, went generic. So that's clearly fair game for a reformulation in the hands of another company like Avalyn. Can you talk about what, in more detail about the actual Ep206, you call it, this candidate? It's a combination of pirfenidone, but delivered in a novel way. How does this work?
Yep. So as I mentioned, we're delivering these with an inhalation. And so that requires that we now formulate those drugs for inhalation. And this is no small technical feat. So Both of these drugs are very challenging to formulate, but we have a team of really experts in this field that are deep knowledge of how to formulate these drugs for inhalation. So we have patents around that formulation, of course, and then a bunch of other patents. We have 11 issued with 2 more pending on the AP01 program. But when we put the drug into in our case, a nebulizer, so there's a whole set of work that's required to think carefully about what the right inhaler is. And that has to do with the drug itself. Not all drugs are going to be amenable to all kinds of inhalers. It also has to do with the particle size that you need to generate. So depending on where in the lung you're trying to get to, you need to generate a different particle size to get there. Not all inhalers are going to get you to the right particle size that you need. And then I think the third factor that I think is probably the most important to consider on the company side is the patient need. And what I mean by that is you really have to think deeply about what patients can actually inhale. So in this disease, as I mentioned, these patients have issues with cough. And we want to try to find, therefore, a nebulizer that is going to minimize that cough risk and minimize the existing symptom that they already have in the disease. And so, an optimal solution for the patient for this disease, in my opinion, is a nebulizer. We're using, in our case, a handheld nebulizer. It's the same device platform that Insmed uses for AirCase and that Gilead uses for Caisson. So it's itself a licensed, patented device. And we have exclusivity with that device for these molecules. And so the way that works is that we now benefit from the patents we have on our drug itself. Because of the exclusivity that we have, we also benefit tremendously from the patents that the device manufacturer has on the device. And then when we put the two together, it's almost like making cereal in the morning, making breakfast for yourself. Sometimes people want more milk, sometimes people want less milk. You've got to customize the two to each other. And you have to consider then tweaks to the device to allow you to deliver the drug most optimally. But what's great about that is that allows us to file what are called drug device combination patents, which end up being incredibly important here. And we have those in place as well. So we have really 3 layers of protection on the patent side. We then have exclusivity in the device. And I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the reason I love the therapeutic area so much, FDA has some quite complex barriers to entry to generic approvals with inhalers as well. And the reason for that is if you can imagine it, one inhaler to the next is actually completely different in terms of particle size and flow rate, deposition pattern. And so for that reason, FDA requires that a generic company with nebulized inhalers needs to do large scale clinical trials to get an approval in the first place. And so that means, as I said earlier, that between the patents, the exclusivity that we have in the device platform, and then these FDA barriers, it's very challenging for someone to be able to compete, allowing a company like mine to build these really durable long-term revenue streams.
So when you looked at various inhaling systems to get these small molecule drugs deep into the lungs where you think they need to go, I think into the alveoli, the bronchial tubes, like deep down. You couldn't do something just like, over the counter Primatene mist, right? That just sprays something that mostly ends up at the back of your throat. Probably is going to make you cough a little bit. I mean, it might release, it helps some people with asthma a little bit, but that's not going to do it. And the PARI nebulizer that you mentioned from Germany, I think, has been around. It's been established. It creates this very fine mist that just kind of floats down into like you breathe it in, and then it takes a few minutes. Can you describe a little more how this works?
Yeah, sure. It's a nebulizer. So how it works is it relies on the patient's own breathing in order to deploy the molecule. So it does create a very fine mist, as you said. In this disease, we want to generate small particles that are going to get out to those distal tissues. But as in every lung disease, there's sort of a Goldilocks size. If it's too small, you breathe it right back out again. It doesn't stick, right? So you want it to be small enough that it will get there, but large enough that it will stick when it gets there. So that's the trick here with the formulation is finding that Goldilocks size for the disease.
Nice.
And and this nebulizer is really gentle. So the mist that comes out, I always think about it, if you ever had asthma as a kid or know anyone who did, My mom used to put in my room when I was sick a humidifier, right, which kind of made this like a little bit damp mist. And it's somehow easier on your lungs to breathe in something that's a little bit damp. It just reduces that cough issue and is a little bit soothing. So this is a tiny bit damp, but you almost can't feel the moisture in it at all because it's the particles are so tiny. But it relies on a patient just breathing normally over the course of time. So with our programs, patients we think will be using these drugs probably somewhere between 8.5 and 10 minutes each time they dose. And that'll be twice a day. But what's great about that from my perspective is even if they have, let's say they have a cough when they start breathing in with a nebulizer, you're not relying on that single inhalation to deliver the drug. You're relying on 8 to 10 minutes worth of normal breathing. And so again, this is just a really gentle solution for this population. You may be familiar, it sounds like you are, with asthma COPD. It's normal that patients that are older and don't have great hand-eye coordination in that disease sometimes need nebulizers. Children need nebulizers. They can't really dose with a meter dose or dry powder inhaler. So for this patient population, I think this is an elegant solution and is a little customizable, right? So if you're a patient that has actually pretty good capacity, you might be able to breathe it in and out a little bit faster. If you're someone that has more limited capacity, shallow breathing, it may take you a few minutes, another minute or two longer, but it's customizable in that sense because it's responsive to the patient's own normal tidal breathing pattern.
And this thing is it's portable, it's battery operated, right? You can put it in a purse or a backpack, take it, live your life normally.
Yeah, I'll hold it up on the screen. No one can see me, I know, but it's maybe a little bigger than an iPhone. Like there's a computer part of it that's a little bigger than an iPhone, and then there's a handheld part which is probably about the size of an iPhone, that you just really put in your mouth and just breathe in and out using your normal pattern, as I said. So I think it's a great technical solution for this patient population.
Okay. And you said earlier that you're able to dramatically reduce the dose, something like greater than tenfold on pirfenidone and even more on the nintedanib. And so, but even so, with those smaller doses, you're able to get higher concentration of the active pharmaceutical ingredient where you want it in those lung tissues. And that should translate, as you say, into a milder side effect profile. What have you seen so far from your clinical trials?
Yeah. So I think what is really unique about this disease, which is different from some others. So investors ask me all the time about pulmonary hypertension. Probably a good time to say to you, pulmonary hypertension is not a lung disease. It's a disease of the pulmonary vasculature. You can't measure your exposure in the pulmonary vasculature as readily as you can in this disease. This disease is a lung disease. As you said, Luke, you're clearly very well aware. We're trying to get to the alveoli and the bronchioles and the deep parts of the lung with this treatment, and we're able to actually sample lung exposure in those tissues. We do it here by doing a bronchoalveolar lavage, and that's also called the bronchoscopy, where we collect epithelial lining fluid data. And we can dose healthy volunteers, which we've done in this program, with the oral, and then we can evaluate our exposure in those tissues with an oral dose. And we've also dosed healthy volunteers with the inhaled, and similarly done that same bronchoalveolar lavage work to collect the data. So we're able to look at our exposure in the target area with the inhaled versus the oral through that model.
That's a gentle scrape that the doctor does to collect those cells, right? Because it's irritating. You got to be careful down there.
That's that you do. Yeah, you can't do it in patients because you'd be worried about causing exacerbation, which you don't want to do.
Okay, but you've gotten the exposures that you'd like to see from healthy volunteers. How about the clinical endpoints? What have you seen so far, and what do you need to see in your ongoing studies?
Yeah, sure. So the preclinical work, the exposure that I talked about, we always want to optimize inhaled versus oral. So with nintedanib as an example, the inhaled is, we think, 27 times higher in terms of Cmax and AUC than the oral, even despite the fact that we're lowering the dose there from 150 to 4. And so that's exciting. We've looked then at pirfenidone, switching back to the AP01 program, we've looked at a clinical study In that study, we track and measure forced vital capacity. We call that FVC. That's a symptomatic endpoint that looks at a patient's lung capacity. And we're able to measure that and then look at the difference in FVC over time. The oral drugs, as I mentioned, work in the disease. And when I say they work, what I mean is that on placebo, so untreated, a patient's lung function is likely declining by about 7% per year on average. These oral drugs about halve that. So oral pirfenidone from its big clinical study, which was called Ascend, the lung function decline that they experienced was 3%. So patients are still declining on these oral drugs, but not as profound a rate of decline as they would be if they were untreated. What we saw in Atlas, which is a study that we did, it's a phase 1b study, but we did it in patients. Over 1 year, we actually were able to stabilize lung function. So we had a 0.4% decline, which is analogous to what a normal healthy adult would lose in their lung function over a year. So an exciting early hint of efficacy given the better exposure that we have. And I think what is really exciting about the program beyond just the FVC data, we've been able to keep patients on program on drug for many years now. So some of these patients have been on drug for about 6 years. And on average, for the folks that remain, they're still stable in their lung function all these years out because we're making it possible to keep them on therapy.
You're seeing a higher adherence rate.
That's right. That's right. I mean, what is remarkable to me about the long-term data that we have is that when I talk about it, I want to be clear with you, there is a responder bias here. So we had 100 patients that entered into an open label extension after first year of treatment. We still have, last I saw, 23 patients remaining. So about 1/4 of those remaining. But we're talking now about, as I said, 5 or 6 years out from initial treatment. Reminder that survival in this disease is 3 to 5 years. On average, patients that started in our program were diagnosed 2 years before they started. So there are some patients about 6 years out in the open label that have been diagnosed for 8 years, and they're still on drug and they're still stable in their lung function.
So would you call them moderate to severely ill at baseline when they enter?
Oh yeah, yep. They had to meet inclusion criteria for the study. So yes, serious unmet need. There's a whole cohort of patients that this was last line of therapy for them. They were compassionate use patients. We have those patients still in an open label extension as well. So again, there's a responder bias here to this long-term data. But the point is the fact that we had any patients at all to study this far out is really exciting and remarkable because there literally is no comparable data on the oral programs that can't keep patients alive long enough, never mind on drug, to collect data this far out. And I think we're not aware also of any data in the natural history that goes out this long. So, we're hopeful that this tells us that with this approach, we may be able to offer patients an opportunity to extend survival, which is, incredibly exciting if you're a gal like me.
Yeah, but now so these were the assets and the data packages that you just brought through your recent IPO experience. Congratulations on that, by the way. Successfully raised a lot of money for your late stage clinical program. What can you say about that experience and what that's enabling you to do to take the company to the next level?
Yeah, thank you. So for our APO1 program, that's our inhaled pirfenidone, we've completed enrollment just recently after the IPO in a large global phase 2b study. And we're hopeful that we'll have data back from that in the second half of 27. For our APO2, our inhaled nintedanib, that's underway now in a global phase 2 study. And again, there we think we'll have that fully enrolled and reading out late in 2027. And we haven't talked about, but if you want to, I'm happy to. The third asset we have in our pipeline, it's called Ep206. It's a fixed dose combination of those two agents. A bit of a big idea, which we can come back to if you like, but we're going to be starting phase 1 in that Ep206 program. We're aiming for late this calendar year, and we should have that phase 1 reading out also in the second half of 27. So the IPO positioned us, to raise the capital that we needed to continue to advance all of these programs and start to fund the scale up for phase 3s. And so our expectation is that we will likely have a single phase 3 that will follow for each of APO1 and APO2 following these phase 2 data readouts that I just mentioned in 27. So I'm already underway with designing that phase 3 and getting planning for it.
There's still a pretty long road ahead to gather, a really deep body of evidence before you can submit an application to the FDA. Okay, and then just a bit mechanistically on these two, these drugs have different ways of working, but you're basically thinking that they offer an anti-inflammatory and an anti-fibrotic effect, and is that the idea of combining the two?
Yes and no. With pirfenidone, I didn't mention and certainly can highlight for you. In the pirfenidone program, we also captured imaging data. And so in fibrosis, you actually can see the fibrosis on high-res chest CT scans. So we do that work in the clinical trials so that we can look at and understand whether we're changing the fibrosis. With pirfenidone, we noticed in the imaging that it appears pirfenidone is playing a role as an anti-inflammatory as well as an anti-fibrotic. That's a hypothesis. So we're going to look at the next study that's ongoing and see what that teaches us about pirfenidone's activity. But if it is true that pirfenidone is playing this role as an anti-inflammatory, it may give us some hints for where we might think about studying inhaled pirfenidone in the future. Um, so that's certainly part of the equation. But you mentioned the two drugs are mechanistically different, and so it's really that leads us to want to combine them. So I think, and this is where I think the experience comes in quite handy. In my years working in asthma and COPD, working in pulmonary hypertension, working in a whole slew of other lung diseases, we've really learned that in every lung disease where we have more treatment options, patients are more well served by putting mechanisms together that are different in order to cover a broader part of the pathophysiology of the disease. And everything that we know about pirfenidone and nintedanib tells us that these two agents also should be complementary together. There's actually a clinical study that BI did looking at that question. You see stunning hint of efficacy. We've done some really interesting preclinical work on that as well. And so we're really eager to see about whether it's possible if we can solve the tolerability limitation that is the rate limiter for patients today with inhaled delivery. It will allow us to step up, frankly, the entire treatment algorithm in this disease to one where we can use combination mechanisms for patients, whether that's our fixed dose combo, which is APO3, whether pirfenidone or nintedanib can be a backbone to other companies as they succeed. And we'll use perhaps those new agents that other folks are working on together with the ones that we're optimizing. I think we're incredibly excited about and proud of the opportunity we have to evolve the treatment algorithm in this entire disease because we think that's really what's going to make a big difference for patients.
Now, I understand your trials, it looks like they have 12-month endpoints. Is that right? You
That's
just need
right.
to follow people for a long time to see if you're getting the desired balance of safety and efficacy.
That's right.
Okay, so that's just going to take whatever time it takes to follow people once they've enrolled. Does the resources, how does the IPO change things though? Does it enable you to move any more quickly than you might otherwise have?
Yeah, it certainly allows us to, as I said, start getting ready for the phase 3 so that when we get these phase 2 data readouts, we can move as quickly as possible into the phase 3 portion of the programs. And so that's really optimal. It also gives us the opportunity to think about what else we might do. Luke, you and I have known each other for a while now. You probably get a sense for how much more I want to do in these rare lung diseases beyond just these programs. So we're certainly thinking about that internally and with our board right now. And we're eager to try to frankly, I think we have the opportunity here with Avalyn to build the next Insmed, right? So I think we have a set of foundational assets that are exciting and can be incredibly compelling for these patients, and an opportunity to build upon to do more yet for more patients that need more solutions.
You mentioned the Insmed comparison to me, I think on your IPO day. What is it? What is it about that company that you admire?
I think Will Lewis has just been a great CEO from what I can tell. I think he's built that company. I think that there were people that didn't believe in the potential that they had with their NTM medicine, and the opportunity that they've been able to unleash with that commercial asset, and then their new one that they're in launch mode on with bronchiectasis, another disease. Bronchiectasis is a disease where there was literally nothing. It's the first disease ever approved for bronchiectasis, as far as I'm aware. And I think that they're off to the races with that. So just, it's again back to the same thing, believing in the opportunity you have to impact patients and finding a way to elucidate that opportunity to the larger community as you go and grow and build. And I think they've built a great company. We know many people there, and just they have a really good good team of people, by which I mean exceptionally talented people and good humans. And I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do here as well.
Well, and they've got that same route of administration with the nebulizer. And I just think that that's something that a lot of patients will intuitively understand, this idea that, they've got a severe lung disease. But if you can get more of the drug, if you can get an effective drug with a mild side effect profile, and any doctor can explain that drug, if you inhale it, is going to get where it needs to go.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's got to have a lot of appeal.
Yeah, it's interesting, even more than I realized. So we actually have a patient advisory council here. We have two, one for IPF, one for the non-idiopathic form of the disease, where we talk to patients all the time about what we're doing and get their help and advice on our development plans. And exactly to your point, like there's something about inhaled delivery that seems to resonate with them. I think it's because they feel like they're doing something active to control their disease. Right, it requires a little bit more work than just a pill does. But in this population, they don't seem to mind, and it somehow gives them, it's an intuitive feeling that they have about them doing something to make a difference for themselves.
It's a feeling of agency.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's exactly right. So it's something even that I was surprised by in talking with these patients.
I will eagerly await those next data readouts. This is going to be an important moment for your company and for a lot of people with serious lung diseases, both with AP01 and O2.
I really hope so. Yeah.
Lyn Baranowski, thanks so much for joining me on The Long Run.
Luke, it's always a pleasure. Again, thank you for the time. I always enjoy our conversation so much. So thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Long Run, a production of Timmerman Report. Pedro Rosado of Headstepper Media was the sound editor. Music is from D.A. Wallach. See you next episode.